Hidden Cave Tragedy. On April 8, 2012, 24-year-old Guillermo Pino Jr. joined friends and family on a casual trip to Arroyo Tapiado in California's Anza Borrego Desert State Park. The area is home to a vast network of fascinating unmarked mud caves. Among them was Hidden Cave, a formation known to experienced explorers for its deceptive terrain and dangerous drop-offs. But for Guillermo, this wasn't a planned expedition. He was barefoot, had no flashlight, no water, and no phone, just pure excitement. As the group remained at their campsite, Guillermo wandered ahead. He climbed into the upper entrance of Hidden Cave and called down to the others, asking them to bring his shoes and inviting them to join him. They agreed, but told him it would take time to scale the steep incline. He replied that he'd just goof around inside the cave until they arrived. Then, he vanished into the darkness. Inside, Guillermo navigated a narrow sloping corridor where loose dirt crumbled underfoot. He braced himself against the walls for balance. But with each step, the terrain worsened. The ground turned slippery, the path barely visible. By the time his friends reached the upper entrance with his shoes, Guillermo was nowhere in sight. They called out, but no reply came. Deep within the cave, Guillermo had entered a constricting vertical passage. Crawling blindly through the tight space, he mistook a fragile crust of dirt for solid ground. Suddenly, the ground collapsed. The floor gave way beneath him, and he fell nearly 30 feet or 9 meters into a narrow fissure. The impact was catastrophic. Dirt cascaded down on top of him, wedging his body into the crack. He was pinned, his torso buried, limbs twisted, unable to move. Every breath was a struggle. Every attempt to shift worsened the situation. He was injured, disoriented, and completely alone in total darkness. Back above ground, the group frantically searched, shouting his name into the empty desert. As night fell, they alerted authorities. By morning, a full-scale search was underway. Local law enforcement, specialized cave rescue teams, volunteers, even Border Patrol trackers joined the effort. They combed through the cave system, unsure if Guillermo was still alive or where he could have gone. But the caves offered no answers. Hidden Cave, like many in the park, is a maze of false leads, dead ends, and unstable shafts. Days passed and hopes faded. On April 16th, 8 days after his disappearance, the San Diego Sheriff's Department officially ended the search. Resources were exhausted. The chance of survival was declared close to zero, but his family refused to quit. They organized their own search parties, recruited volunteers, and eventually hired a private investigator. Guillermo's mother would later say, "We couldn't just stop. We knew he was out there somewhere." Then, 27 days after he went missing, came the breakthrough. Using a remote camera, the investigator explored parts of Hidden Cave that had been previously inaccessible. As the camera was lowered into a narrow crack, its light revealed the heartbreaking truth. Guillermo was there, partially buried in dirt, wedged tightly in the shaft where he had fallen. There were no signs of life. He had been gone for weeks. Recovery took 3 grueling days. A specialized mine rescue team from Los Angeles joined local cavers to carefully dig through the fragile terrain. When Guillermo's body was finally retrieved, the autopsy confirmed what everyone feared. He had died of asphyxiation from chest compression, likely within hours of becoming trapped. Río Chontalcuatlán Tragedy. On March 9, 2003, the midday sun blazed over Guerrero, Mexico. A group of tourists arrived at the entrance to Gruta del Río Chontalcuatlán, a cave system popular among thrill-seeking visitors. They were led by local guides, men who had grown familiar with the cave over time, not through formal training, but experience. The tourists came for excitement. What they found was something much darker. The entrance to the cave wasn't gentle or forgiving. It was a steep canyon, a sharp crack in the earth that dropped like a throat into complete darkness. To enter, one had to descend loose, crumbling rock, where every step and every handhold had to be tested. A single mistake could lead to disaster. Among the group was Maria Santos, a young woman who had come to Mexico on vacation, chasing adventure. As the tourists began their descent into the canyon, they spaced out casually along the slope, unaware that this was already a critical mistake. In unstable terrain, climbers must maintain vertical spacing. One person above another means that a single dislodged rock can become a deadly missile. Maria was halfway down, focused on her footing. Above her, another tourist shifted their weight. Whether it was a loose foothold or a fragile hand grip giving way, a limestone boulder, small and ordinary, broke free. Gravity did the rest. The rock accelerated down the slope, just a few pounds in weight, but at that speed, it became a lethal weapon. In the dim light, Maria never saw it coming. The stone struck her head with devastating force, like a sledgehammer blow from above. Her hands lost their grip, her feet slipped, and then she was falling. Her body tumbled violently down the canyon wall, bouncing off jagged rock, each impact worsening the injuries. They could do nothing but watch as her body tumbled out of sight. A long, heavy silence followed, interrupted only by the quiet shifting of rocks below. The guides froze. They had seen accidents before, but this was different. A tourist had just been killed under their watch. The group panicked. Some wanted to rush down and help, but the guide stopped them. The slope was still unstable. Sending more people down could trigger another fall. They waited. Hours passed. When rescuers finally reached Maria, they confirmed what most already feared. The trauma from the initial impact was catastrophic. Even without the fall, she likely would not have survived. The rescue team now faced the grim task of recovering her body from the same deadly slope. It took hours. Every step risked dislodging more rock. The rescuers used ropes and anchors, carefully maneuvering around unstable sections of the canyon. They had to secure Maria's body to a stretcher and haul it back up the jagged path without triggering another collapse. When they finally reached the surface, the full tragedy became clear. Roubidoux Spring Cave. On August 23, 2003, 3 experienced cave divers stood at the edge of Roubidoux Spring Cave in Missouri. Among them was 50-year-old Stephen Wybrocht, a dedicated diving enthusiast. With him were Ron Shirley and John Davis, both seasoned cave explorers. They had been planning this dive for weeks, excited to reach the enormous underground chamber known as the Big Room, hidden 1,400 feet or 427 meters from the entrance and 165 feet or 50 meters beneath the surface. Roubidoux Spring Cave is not a place for amateurs. Its twisting tunnels and deep passages require extensive planning, training, and specialized gear. All 3 divers carried the required certifications, and their equipment reflected the seriousness of the dive. They wore dry suits to shield themselves from the cold 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius water and insulating layers underneath to maintain body heat. Each man carried twin tanks filled with trimix, a carefully balanced mix of oxygen, nitrogen, and helium. Additional stage bottles were strapped to their gear, one filled with trimix, the other with nitrox for decompression. The divers also brought underwater scooters, handheld propulsion devices that would help conserve energy and air. For Stephen, this was his first dive using one. It was supposed to be a new milestone in his diving journey. They entered the spring pool and began their descent. The water at the surface was crystal clear, but they knew visibility could vanish deeper in, where a careless kick could stir up clouds of silt. Their first stop was the drop-off, a point 350 feet or 107 meters into the cave, where the floor suddenly falls from 50 feet or 15 meters to over 130 feet or 40 meters. There, they would leave their nitrox tanks to use later on their way out. Switching to their Trimix travel tanks, they powered on their scooters and continued into the deeper zone known as Wichita Avenue. The passage stretched for over 1,100 feet or 335 meters and stayed close to 150 feet or 46 meters in depth. Their lights cut through the black water, revealing ancient limestone formations and flashes of cave-adapted life. But beneath the calm surface of the dive, trouble was already brewing. Stephen's stage bottle was draining faster than expected. Whether from adjusting to the scooter or a small leak, he began using his back-mounted tanks sooner than planned. He didn't mention it to the others. The group pressed on and finally reached the big room, a wide, eerie chamber so massive their lights couldn't illuminate the entire space. They floated for a moment in silence, taking in a sight only few divers would ever witness. Then, it was time to go back. As they retraced their path through Wichita Avenue, Stephen checked his pressure gauge. It read just 500 psi, or about 34 bars, which is dangerously low. A typical tank begins with around 3,000 psi, so he had burned through nearly 85% of his air. He quickly signaled Ron and showed him the gauge. Ron responded immediately, offering his secondary regulator on an extended hose, which Stephen took. Now, breathing from Ron's tank, Stephen continued beside him, but things got worse. Stephen was struggling with buoyancy. He rose too high, then dropped too low, fighting to maintain depth. Ron stayed close. John had gone ahead, unaware of the situation unfolding behind him. As they reached the drop-off and began ascending, Stephen's buoyancy control failed completely. He floated upward too quickly, reaching the end of Ron's hose. The regulator popped from his mouth. He swam back down, reconnected to the backup, and gave Ron the OK hand signal. Then he vanished. The silt they had stirred now filled the water, turning everything into a cloudy blur. Ron couldn't see him anymore. At the 70-foot or 21-meter decompression stop, Stephen's bottle was still untouched. John had already retrieved his and moved on. Hoping Stephen had made contact with another dive group, Ron collected his gear and continued toward the surface. When he surfaced, he gave the news. Stephen was missing. Rescue divers were dispatched immediately. They found Stephen's body floating near the ceiling of the cave, not far from where Ron had last seen him. All three of his tanks were empty, and his dry suit's exhaust valve was completely closed, meaning air couldn't escape as he ascended, likely the cause of his buoyancy loss of control. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for similar ones and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments.